He was expected to return to duty as if nothing had happened. No breakdown, no disaster, no crushing defeat. But beneath the surface, the truth was unbearable, buried under layers of silence and denial. What really happened after Midway wasn't just a military loss, it was a collapse from within. Lies replaced lessons, fear silenced reason, and a once proud command structure began to rot from the top down. This is the untold story of how one battle didn't just shift the tide of war, it exposed the cracks that would ultimately bring down an empire. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood quietly on the deck of the colossal battleship Yamato, his aged hands holding the rail as he stared out at the seemingly peaceful Pacific Ocean. It was the morning of June 4, 1942, and although the sea appeared calm, a monumental naval confrontation was quietly beginning to take shape, one that would test the limits of Japan's military command. Yamamoto had spent months crafting what he believed to be a brilliant strategy, unaware that it would soon reveal fatal flaws within the very system he led. The operation, named Me, was intended to bait the American fleet into a trap near Midway, where Japan's superior forces would crush them and tighten their grip on the Pacific. To carry out this mission, Yamamoto had assembled a naval armada unlike anything seen before. The force included 4 carriers, nearly a dozen battleships, a formidable number of cruisers and destroyers, and additional support vessels and submarines. It was the peak of Japan's maritime strength and unstoppable tide that had surged across the Pacific since the attack on Pearl Harbor. As daylight spread across the sky, early signs of complication began to surface. Vice Admiral Kiichi, operating from the carrier Akagi, soon found himself at a crossroads that would highlight deep-rooted issues in Japan's chain of command. His 4 carriers Akagi, Kagasoryu, and Haruhide launched an initial airstrike on Midway Island. However, the feedback was far from reassuring. U.S. defenses were more resilient than anticipated, and the airfield remained functional. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga, who led the aerial attack, sent word that a second strike was necessary. Nagumo received the message at 7 a.m., and the tension in his expression tightened. His planes, which were armed for a naval clash, would need to be re-equipped for another land assault operation that would consume critical time. According to historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's naval records, Japan's rigid leadership structure designed for careful planning rather than swift adjustments was ill-suited to sudden changes. Nagumo, burdened with responsibility, hesitated. Below deck, crews began frantically switching weapons, swapping torpedoes for bombs. This hurried effort made the carriers dangerously exposed. This moment underscored the paradox at the heart of Japan's military strength. The strict discipline that had driven their past victories was now proving to be a weakness. Officers waited passively for decisions from their superiors, who themselves were frozen by the complexity of the unfolding situation. At 7:28 a.m., the balance shifted dramatically. A scout plane sent a startling update: an American fleet had been spotted, including a carrier, around 240 miles from Midway. The news struck like a thunderclap. The enemy wasn't where they had been expected, they were much closer. The foundation of the operation was crumbling, and with it, the confidence of Japan's naval leadership. Nagumo, still on Akagi's bridge, stood motionless, struggling with a decision that might decide the empire's future. The well-laid plan was falling apart, and for the first time in his storied career, the admiral was uncertain. The burden was growing heavier by the minute. Below decks, the rearming process continued under immense stress. Eastward, the carriers pressed on, vulnerable and off balance. Commander Minoru Genda Nagumos, Chief of Staff, observed his superior anxiously. The admiral's face had lost its color, and his hands trembled as he gripped the rail. This was no longer the bold strategist who had struck Pearl Harbor with confidence. Genda spoke cautiously, urging a prompt decision, warning that the enemy might strike at any time. But Nagumo didn't respond. He stared out over the water, searching silently for clarity. The very structure that had served Japan in peace was now failing in war. Subordinates dared not act without instructions, and the man meant to guide them was overwhelmed. The options were grim. If Nagumo launched an attack with the planes currently available, they'd be under-equipped to face a possibly stronger opponent. But waiting for the rearming to finish and for the first wave to return from Midway risked losing all surprise. Every passing minute benefited the Americans. At 8 a.m., things worsened. Updates from the Midway attackers poured in. Not only were US defenses holding, but they were responding with greater strength than expected. Tominaga radioed again. Enemy resistance was fierce, and losses were mounting. A second strike was no longer just recommended, it was essential. Nagumo could no longer mask his distress. Witnesses would later recall how the composed figure of the admiral unraveled. He paced restlessly, whispering in frustration and anxiety. "What will His Majesty think?" he murmured, voicing the unbearable weight of representing the Emperor's will in battle. This psychological strain radiated outward, infecting the command structure. Officers, once fearless, now doubted themselves. Communication staff hesitated to pass on orders, afraid to deepen the crisis. Navigators rechecked charts they once read with certainty. The entire air fleet command was seizing up. Right when clear, fast action was desperately needed. At 8:30 a.m., Nagumo made a pivotal call. He postponed the strike against the American fleet until the rearming was complete and the Midway planes had returned. It was a compromise made under pressure, meeting no tactical need and multiplying the risks. His staff exchanged uneasy glances. They recognized the danger in the decision but could not challenge it. Japan's military hierarchy did not allow it. Meanwhile, American dive bombers were en route, speeding over the Pacific. The delay Nagumo chose would soon have irreversible consequences. Yet, in that moment, the burden on him was too great to realize the full danger. Once hailed as the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, he was learning that battle required not just planning and precision, but the courage to act swiftly under crushing uncertainty. By 9 a.m., what had started as a proud, unstoppable force now teetered on the edge of collapse. Below deck, the weapon change continued, but the once organized process had turned into a disorderly and dangerous mess. Fuel hoses stretched across decks, and explosive materials lay scattered. 80 mistake could turn disaster into catastrophe. The unrelenting pressure had triggered a wave of errors. Captain Jisaku Okada aboard the Kaga struggled to keep his team focused, but as fear spread among his officers, mistakes multiplied. Safety rules were ignored, tools dropped, and discipline once a point of pride was falling apart. When a sailor voiced concerns about hazardous fuel lines, Okada lashed out angrily, snapping at him to obey orders. The tension had worn through even the most disciplined leaders. On the Soryu, Captain Ryosaku Yamamoto faced his own crisis of belief. A career officer who had always followed commands without question, he now saw chaos blooming around him. For the first time, he began to suspect the Americans had seen through their plan. What was meant to be a flawless victory had become a trap. At 9:18 a.m., the first U.S. torpedo bombers came into view. Akagi's lookouts shouted warnings across the fleet, but instead of the calm, trained response they had drilled for, panic and confusion followed. Nagumo, still shaken from earlier hesitation, gave no clear direction to repel the attack. Though the American torpedo bombers flew outdated planes and launched an uncoordinated strike, the impact on Japanese morale was crushing. As the Devastator aircraft crawled through the sky, their pilots visible from below, Japanese commanders, felt something fracture inside their ranks. These were not elite opponents, but brave men in old machines, yet their audacity sent a chilling message. Chief of Staff Kusaka watched the wave of American losses with unease. Though the attackers were shot down, their mission had drawn Japanese fighters to low altitude, leaving the skies above exposed. It was a costly tactical oversight, one that would have been obvious under normal conditions, but pressure had dulled the edge of even the sharpest leaders. Communications between ships fell into chaos. Once known for flawless coordination, the fleet's radio systems now carried conflicting messages and panicked cries. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, recovering from surgery aboard Akagi, listened in disbelief as the orderly command network disintegrated. "What has happened to us?" he whispered, giving voice to the growing dread in every experienced officer. As the morning wore on, the strain on leadership pushed them past their limits. The once reliable chain of command had become a burden. Officers who had built their careers on obedience now faced situations where no instructions came, while those responsible for making decisions were too overwhelmed to act. From the outside, the fleet still looked like a fearsome force, but inside, it was crumbling under the stress of command failure. At 9:25 a.m., just as the last American torpedo plane was destroyed, the true threat emerged from above. American dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, descended from high altitude. The Japanese, still fixated on the sea-level threat they had just defeated, never saw them coming. The attack struck with terrifying precision as if the skies themselves had turned against them. At precisely 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's group of dive bombers initiated their descent, engines howling as they plunged toward the Japanese carriers. On board the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally lifted his gaze from the charts before him, only to see disaster rapidly approaching. But by that moment, the Japanese command had already unraveled beyond recovery. What followed was a clear and grim display of a leadership structure in total disarray. Aboard the Kaga, Captain Okada stood motionless as the first bomb exploded. On deck, flames erupted, turning the flight deck into a nightmare of shredded steel and ignited fuel. Ironically, the same fuel lines his crew had been cautioned about just hours earlier now served as efficient pathways for the fire, tearing through the ship's interior. Over the deafening blaze, Okada's last commands were fragmented and contradictory. To abandon the vessel were followed by shouts to fight the fire, only to reverse again moments later. Meanwhile, aboard the Soryu, Captain Yamamoto met his own grim fate with slightly more composure, though the outcome was equally devastating. As American ordnance tore through the core of his ship, he made a fateful decision. Rather than organize efforts to manage the damage or evacuate personnel, he chose to remain aboard and go down with the vessel, adhering to the time-honored Bushido Code. Although his actions were steeped in personal honor, his choice left the remaining crew without direction at a time when decisive guidance might have saved many lives. The Akagi stood out as the most sorrowful example of command failure. Admiral Nagumo, who had once spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor, appeared utterly incapable of action as his flagship was engulfed in flames. His aides had to carry him bodily from the bridge as he muttered disjointed phrases about duty to the emperor. Witnessing their leader so mentally shattered crushed the spirits of the crew. Even senior officers, who had served with loyalty and distinction, wept openly upon realizing that those entrusted with their lives had crumbled. Though the American dive bombers delivered the final blow, the damage had already been done by Japanese leaders themselves. The breakdown was not merely in strategy, it was in the very fabric of their military hierarchy. Officers who had spent years rehearsing drills and ceremonies found themselves unable to cope with the unpredictability of real combat. Commander Fushida, still recovering from surgery, observed the unfolding destruction from a stretcher on the Akagi's deck as the carrier tilted and thick smoke filled the sky. He considered the failure around him. In his later writings, he reflected that their training had prepared them for triumph, but never for the shock of losing. Japan's rigid military system had cultivated commanders who could follow flawless plans, yet were paralyzed the moment circumstances deviated. The Hiryu, the only carrier left afloat from Nagumo's fleet, stood as a final tragic monument to the leadership vacuum. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, now the highest-ranking officer among the surviving units, faced an overwhelming burden. Instead of devising a strategic retreat or rallying what remained, he launched a final, desperate assault. His parting message to Admiral Yamamoto announcing the attack reflected not sound military logic, but a bid to restore lost honor. The human consequences of the command failure were catastrophic. Thousands of sailors found themselves aboard burning ships with no clear instructions. The inflexible structure of the Imperial Navy had left enlisted men frozen, awaiting commands from officers who themselves had no direction. This led to confusion and needless death on a massive scale. By day's end, 3 of Japan's carriers were either sinking or completely destroyed. Their aircraft and expert pilots were gone, but even more damaging was the collapse in morale. The illusion of Japanese naval supremacy, so carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, was left in ruins. What was once expected to be a swift and victorious campaign had turned into the most crushing naval defeat in Japanese history. By late afternoon, the battered remnants of the fleet began to retreat, abandoning more than just ships they left behind. The very confidence that had driven Japan's expansion in the Pacific, the intensity of modern war had revealed the flaws in their military doctrine, flaws that would never be fully addressed. Even the withdrawal was marked by continuing leadership breakdowns. Admiral Yamamoto, stationed aboard the colossal battleship Yamato, hundreds of miles away, found himself afflicted by the same indecision that had crippled his commanders. The mastermind behind both the Pearl Harbor strike and the Midway campaign sat isolated, quietly absorbing report after report of devastation. The toll on his psyche was immediate and visible. As the surviving vessels of the task force limped westward, their leaders struggled to make sense of the disaster. Captain Amari Takahashi, commanding the destroyer Naki, one of the few undamaged ships, wrote in his journal that the confident warriors of the morning now seemed like broken old men, whispering and avoiding each other's gaze, as if fearful of acknowledging the truth aloud. The crisis extended far beyond the battlefield. As news of the defeat filtered through the fleet, it triggered a chain reaction of doubt throughout the ranks. Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, responsible for the escorting force, found himself unable to communicate clear orders. The very framework that had underpinned the Japanese Navy began to fracture as officers lost faith in their superiors and in themselves. Perhaps the most heart-rending symbol of collapse came from Nagumo, evacuated to the light cruiser Nagara. He sat silently in the wardroom, unresponsive. Captain Kusaka, his chief of staff, attempted to brief him on current developments, but Nagumo only repeated a single sentence, over and over: "I have failed the Emperor." The weight of his failure had crushed him entirely. Coordination among the various Japanese forces had all but vanished. Despite his reputation for brilliance, Yamamoto could not mount a coherent response to the unfolding catastrophe. His orders were erratic and delayed, betraying his own inner turmoil. Other elements of the fleet, which might have turned the tide, or at least mitigated the loss, received no usable instructions. Eventually, they withdrew without contributing at all. Even the submarine group, which had been in position to intercept fleeing American ships, failed to act effectively. Vice Admiral Teruza Komatsu, who led the submarines, received conflicting and delayed updates. His inability to orchestrate a coordinated strike against the U.S. forces marked yet another missed opportunity. As evening fell, the scale of the disaster came into full view. Japan had lost 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and many of its most skilled aviators, but the material losses, while enormous, told only part of the story. Beneath the surface, the psychological damage ran deeper. The leadership structure had crumbled. Confidence was shattered. and the trauma of watching their commanders fail them would haunt Japanese forces for the rest of the war. Rather than facing the truth and learning from the defeat, the high command chose a different path: concealment. The extent of the losses was kept secret from the public and even from many in the military. This refusal to acknowledge the failure only deepened the damage. Instead of changing course, they clung to a narrative designed to preserve pride. Admiral Osami Nagano, head of the Navy's General Staff, held an emergency meeting in Tokyo shortly after receiving the battle reports. The officers presents whence the elite of Japan's naval leadership sat in silence, stunned by the magnitude of what had occurred, but rather than dissect what went wrong, they scrambled to protect reputations and spin the story. The official reports were falsified almost immediately. The destruction of 4 carriers was downplayed as minor damage to a single vessel. Pilots who had died were listed as temporarily missing. Most notably, the complete collapse of command during the battle was rebranded as a calculated withdrawal in the face of overwhelming odds. The truth disappeared under a pile of half-truths and outright fiction. Vice Admiral Sachi Ito, tasked with reporting the defeat to the imperial court, found himself delivering a carefully worded account filled with technical language that concealed the real story. He claimed that surprise attacks in enemy numbers had momentarily disrupted operations, but emphasized that the fleet had retreated in order. Though the statement was technically correct, it grossly distorted reality. The deception had a devastating impact on the survivors. Captain Kusaka, who had served alongside Nagumo, was forced to endorse reports he knew were lies. This ethical compromise inflicted yet another layer of psychological damage on men already dealing with the horror of the battle. Many began to doubt not just themselves, but the entire military institution they had devoted their lives to. This culture of denial permeated the entire Navy. Instructors at flight schools were forbidden from discussing what had happened. Intelligence officers who had warned of potential threats were reassigned or silenced. The refusal to face reality became more damaging than any enemy attack. Perhaps the most tragic part was what became of Nagumo. Rather than being allowed to step down and recover, he was transferred to a new command and told to carry on as though nothing had happened. The cost of ignoring the truth was immense. The officers returned, not only with physical scars, but with a deep sense of betrayal, knowing their leaders had failed and that no one would ever be held accountable. The illusion of Japanese naval dominance, nurtured since the Meiji era, had been destroyed in a single daon. The system that enabled it chose to pretend otherwise. The man who had suffered a complete emotional collapse under the weight of responsibility was expected to return to his position as if nothing significant had taken place at Midway. The burden of pretending everything was normal, while silently battling personal guilt and trauma, stayed with him throughout the remainder of his career. Because the truth of the defeat was hidden, the military missed the opportunity to improve its leadership model and training methods. The strict chain of command that had so disastrously failed at Midway stayed intact. Since admitting its shortcomings would mean revealing the reality of the loss, young officers who could have learned valuable lessons were instead taught falsehoods based on manipulated records, ensuring that similar mistakes would be made again in the future. The cost of this deception was immense. Families received inaccurate reports about the fate of their loved ones, which robbed them of the chance to grieve properly. The Japanese people, misled about their Navy's actual performance, continued to place their faith in strategies and commanders who had already proven incapable. The lie became deeply rooted, slowly weakening the nation's resolve and its war effort. As time passed, and the extent of the defeat could no longer be hidden, military leaders were cornered by their own fabrications. The false narratives had become so widely accepted and repeated that reversing them would have required exposing the entire web of deceit. Those who had failed in battle were now failing their nation by denying the population the truth it needed. To understand the gravity of the situation, the consequences of these failures went far beyond Midway. The same inability to lead effectively would be repeated again and again as the Pacific War dragged on, each time with fewer resources and increasing desperation. The refusal to acknowledge mistakes, paired with a coordinated effort to hide the truth, created a destructive cycle that eventually led to the empire's downfall. The emotional toll on the officers who survived the battle was lasting. Admiral Nagumo, transferred to a new post in the Central Pacific, never recovered from the mental wounds he suffered. His leadership during the later Battle of the Philippine Sea showed the same hesitance and confusion that had contributed to the catastrophe at Midway. When U.S. forces invaded Saipan, he chose to take his own life rather than face another failure, a final sign that the pressures of command had broken him completely. Vital lessons that should have emerged from the Midway defeat were never truly accepted by the Japanese Navy. Key vulnerabilities such as the danger to aircraft carriers during operations, the critical importance of managing battle damage, and the need for adaptable command went unaddressed, as confronting them would have meant admitting the truth. Because of this, Japanese carriers remained susceptible to the same attacks. and their commanders continued to make the same strategic mistakes. The culture of denial born from the Midway disaster seeped into every layer of military operations. Reports were frequently altered to support existing beliefs rather than provide accurate insights into enemy strength. The effects of battles were downplayed in official records to maintain morale, which prevented commanders from making informed decisions about their combat readiness. This widespread dishonesty, initially meant to cover one defeat, became a defining trait of military culture, contributing to repeated failures across the war. The emotional impact extended into Japanese society. Families of the fallen were given fabricated accounts of their relatives' sacrifices, leaving them without closure. The population, misinformed about the war's direction, continued backing military plans that had already proven ineffective. This growing disconnect between propaganda and battlefield reality would only intensify the collective shock Japan experienced after its final defeat. Strategically, the implications of Midway were worsened by leadership's refusal to accept the truth. The loss of 4 carriers and their elite aviators was a blow from which the Japanese Navy never truly recovered. More damaging than the equipment, however, was the collapse in trust and confidence among those in charge. Officers who made it through the battle were burdened with the memory that, when it mattered most, their superiors had failed them, a realization that would shape every future choice they made. While American success at Midway owed much to superior planning and execution, it was also a victory over a command system that couldn't cope with the demands of modern warfare. What had functioned effectively in peacetime, a rigid structure, became a critical weakness when tested in real conflict. As the war continued and Japan suffered more defeats, the pattern established at Midway reappeared again and again. At Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and countless smaller confrontations, Japanese leaders showed the same inability to adjust and make bold choices under stress. Rather than serving as a turning point for learning, the memory of Midway became a source of hesitation. Officers who had seen the leadership fall apart at Midway were unable to act decisively later. Paralyzed by the fear of making another mistake, what had once been a confident command environment turned into one ruled by anxiety and second-guessing. Tragically, the lessons of Midway, had they been embraced, could have improved Japan's ability to fight a defensive war. Greater flexibility in leadership, honest evaluation of enemy capabilities, and improved damage response were all urgently needed. But because the high command refused to confront their failures, these insights were lost, and the same avoidable mistakes were made again and again. Midway ultimately became a symbol of what happens when leadership fails in the face of pressure. The commanders of the Japanese military, when truly tested, proved unprepared to lead effectively under fire. Their inability to adjust or make sound decisions didn't just cost them a battle, it cost them their empire. The battle exposed deep cracks in the system that no amount of individual bravery could repair. The carriers that sank carried down. With them more than hardware, they dragged to the depths the illusion of Japanese superiority and the self-belief of a military command that had collapsed under pressure. In the end, the most significant loss at Midway was not the carriers or the planes, but the complete breakdown of command in a moment that defined the future of the war in the Pacific. This story serves as a powerful reminder of how leadership, under pressure, can shape the course of history. The Battle of Midway was not just a turning point in a military sense, it exposed deep flaws in decision-making, accountability, and adaptability within the Japanese command. What followed wasn't only a series of defeats on the battlefield, but a gradual unraveling of trust, confidence, and truth within the very system meant to lead the nation. Instead of confronting mistakes and learning from them, the leadership chose to hide behind false reports and rigid structures, repeating the same errors until there was nothing left to defend. The human cost was immense, not just in lives lost, but in the grief, disillusionment, and psychological scars carried by those who survived. Midway stands today as a lesson in what happens when those in power fail to adapt and refuse to face hard truths. It reminds us that courage alone cannot compensate for flawed leadership, and that denial in the face of failure only leads to deeper consequences. In the end, it wasn't just ships that sank in the Pacific, it was the weight of an empire's pride, carried down by the very people entrusted to guide it through war.